The air inside the Manchester cotton mill tastes of metal and coal dust. It's 5:30 in the morning, February 1834, and the first light barely reaches through windows caked with soot and condensation. The wooden floor planks are already vibrating. The water wheel turned over an hour ago, and the old power looms have been running since the night shift began their final hours. Workers arrive in clusters, their breath visible in the cold factory air. Women in worn cotton dresses and men in patched trousers move between spinning frames and carding machines, their shoes creating a steady percussion against the boards. The sound is particular to this hour. Footsteps, the creak of leather, the soft rustle of fabric, all threading through the mechanical drone that never quite stops. Children, some as young as 8, slip between the older workers, heading toward their stations near the spinning mules. Their hands are already stained with oil from yesterday's shift. One boy carries a small brush for cleaning beneath the moving parts. Another holds a candle stub, though the foreman has told them repeatedly not to bring open flames near the cotton dust. The smell is layered. First, the sharp tang of machine oil, then the sweetness of raw cotton fiber, underneath it all the acrid bite of coal smoke from the steam engine next door. When you breathe deeply, the air catches slightly in your throat. Then you see it. In the center bay, where the old hand-powered Jenny used to stand, there's something new. The self-acting mule stretches nearly 40 feet across the floor. Its frame is iron, painted black, still gleaming where hands haven't touched it yet. The carriage that holds the spindles sits on iron wheels, attached to a complex system of gears and belts that connect back to the main drive shaft running along the ceiling. It's not moving yet. The workers coming on shift slow as they pass it. Some glance at it and look away quickly. Others stop, studying the gearing, the exposed moving parts, the heavy iron frame that will slide back and forth once the power is engaged. There are no guards over the gears, no barriers around the belt system, just iron and motion waiting to begin. A spinner named William Radcliffe, 42 years old, 26 years in the mills, stands near the new machine with his hands in his pockets. He worked the old mules, knew how to time the movements, how to piece broken threads while the carriage was in motion. This new machine is different. It moves on its own. The timing is mechanical now, not human. He's been told to learn it, to operate it, to keep pace with it. Around him, other workers are taking their positions at machines they know. The familiar looms, the tested spinning frames. Equipment they've learned to read, to anticipate. Equipment that hurt them before and might again, but at least the danger is known. The foreman appears from the overseer's office, pocket watch in hand. He's a thin man named Ashworth, promoted from the floor 5 years ago, now responsible for keeping production steady. He walks to the self-acting mule and places one hand on its iron frame, looks at Radcliffe, nods. 6 o'clock. Somewhere in the building, someone throws a lever. The main drive shaft begins to turn. The belt system engages with a sound like wind filling a sail, and the new machine comes alive. The carriage begins to move outward on its iron wheels, drawing out the cotton threads. The spindles rotate, twist the fibers. Then, smoothly, mechanically, without human hands guiding it, the carriage reverses direction, drawing back in, winding the finished thread onto the spindles. Out and back, out and back. The sound is different from the old machines, more deliberate. The iron wheels create a low rumble against the wooden floor. The gears mesh with a clicking rhythm. The spindles hum at a higher pitch than hand-powered frames. Radcliffe watches the first cycle, then the second. On the third cycle, he steps closer, trying to judge when to enter the space between the moving carriage and the frame to piece a broken thread. The timing is faster than he expected. The carriage doesn't slow or hesitate at the end of its stroke. It simply reverses, driven by gears that don't tire or vary their pace. He glances back at the other workers. A young woman at the neighboring frame has stopped watching. She's focused on her own work, hands moving through familiar motions. but her shoulders are tight, and she's positioned herself with her back to the new machine. The factory fills with sound. Looms clacking, wheels turning, belts slapping against pulleys, the hiss of steam from adjacent rooms. And beneath it all, the new rhythm of the self-acting mule, steady and relentless. The morning shift has begun. The self-acting spinning mule was the culmination of decades of mechanical refinement. Richard Roberts designed it in 1825, patenting the mechanism that allowed the machine to complete the entire spinning cycle without human intervention. By the 1830s, these machines were being installed in mills throughout Lancashire and Yorkshire, replacing the older intermittent mules that required a spinner to manually push and pull the carriage. The danger was in the movement. The carriage weighed several hundred pounds. It travelled on iron wheels along iron rails, pulled by a complex system of ropes and gears connected to the main drive shaft. When spinning, it moved outward, sometimes 10 feet or more, then reversed direction and returned to the frame. This cycle repeated 60 to 80 times per hour, depending on the thread count being produced. Workers had to enter the space between the moving carriage and the stationary frame to piece broken threads, clear cotton waste, or adjust tension. The machine didn't stop for this. Production schedules didn't allow for constant shutdowns. So spinners learned to time their movements, to reach in while the carriage was at the far end of its stroke, to work quickly and withdraw before it reversed. Sometimes they miscalculated. The machine had no guards. The gears that drove the carriage were exposed, directly accessible to anyone standing nearby. The drive belts ran along the ceiling, connected to pulleys that spun at high speed. Cotton dust accumulated on every surface, making the floor slippery, making it hard to see the exact position of moving parts in the dim gaslight. William Radcliffe learned the rhythm over the first week. He watched the carriage complete its stroke, counted to himself, 1, 2, then stepped in to piece a broken thread. His hands moved quickly, joining the broken ends, applying just enough twist, then back out before the carriage returned. The machine didn't care if he was clear. It simply reversed, driven by its gearing, following the cam profiles that Roberts had designed. The sound became familiar, the rumble of the carriage wheels approaching, the click as the gears engaged for the return stroke, the change in pitch from the spindles as they transitioned from drawing to winding. Experienced workers could hear when something was wrong, a belt slipping, a gear beginning to bind, a spindle running at slightly wrong speed. But the new workers, the children brought in to clean and assist, hadn't developed this awareness yet. A 12-year-old named Thomas Hulme worked as a scavenger beneath the mules. His job was to crawl under the moving carriage during operation, brush out the cotton waste that accumulated around the spindles, and oil the moving parts. The space beneath the carriage was perhaps 18 inches high. The floor was slick with oil and cotton dust. The light barely reached under there. He learned to feel the vibration in the floorboards that signaled when the carriage was beginning its return stroke. Learned to flatten himself against the floor, to stay absolutely still until the iron wheels passed over him. Other scavengers worked the same way, timing their movements to the machine's rhythm, trusting their sense of timing more than their vision in the darkness beneath the equipment. The factory kept production records, but didn't systematically document injuries. However, the Manchester Guardian and local parish records from the 1830s and 1840s contain scattered references. A spinner's hand crushed when caught between the carriage and frame at Phillips Mill in 1836. A scavenger's arm broken when the carriage reversed unexpectedly at Clarence Mill in 1838. A piecer who lost 2 fingers in the drive gears at Adelphi Mill in 1841. The reports were brief, often just a name and the nature of the injury. Sometimes not even that, just a note that production was delayed while the machine was cleaned. The workers developed practices, unwritten rules passed from experienced spinners to new ones. Never reach across the carriage. Never turn your back on moving gears. Listen for changes in sound. Watch the position of the belt drive. If a thread breaks, judge whether piecing it is worth the risk or if it's better to let it run broken until the machine stops for another reason. These practices were taught quietly, demonstrated during the brief moments when machines were down for maintenance. The factory owners didn't formalize safety training. The foremen focused on production output, on keeping the machines running, on meeting the week's quotas. Safety was each worker's individual responsibility, learned through observation and sometimes through injury. In the corner of the factory floor, near where the old mules used to operate, there was a wooden box. The workers kept strips of clean cotton cloth in it and a small bottle of whiskey. When someone was injured, a hand cut, a finger crushed, they would use the cloth for binding and the whiskey for pain. The foreman would note the incident if it affected production. Otherwise, the worker would wrap the injury and continue. The machine ran 6 days a week, 14 to 16 hours a day. The sound never quite left your ears. Even at home, after the shift ended, workers reported hearing the rhythm of the carriage, the click of gears, the hum of spindles. The machine had its own presence, its own voice in the factory's soundscape. And everyone who worked near it learned to respect that presence, not with admiration, but with a careful, constant awareness. The knowledge that the machine would not yield, would not slow, would not stop for any human concern unless someone threw the lever to cut power from the drive shaft. By the end of the first month, Radcliffe could work the self-acting mule without conscious thought. His hands knew the timing. His body understood the rhythm. But he never stopped listening to the sound of the carriage wheels, never stopped judging the distance, never fully relaxed in its presence. Because the machine, for all its efficiency and mechanical precision, was fundamentally indifferent to the people who operated it. In 1842, a factory surgeon named John Holland testified before the Parliamentary Commission on the Employment of Children. He had treated workers from mills throughout Stockport for nearly 20 years. His testimony included detailed descriptions of injuries, but it also included something more revealing: accounts of the fear workers experienced in anticipation of injury. Holland described spinners who developed what he called involuntary starts, sudden flinching movements triggered by sounds that resembled machinery, a door closing sharply, metal scraping against stone. These reflexes appeared after months or years of working near self-acting mules, and they persisted even when workers were away from the factory. One of Holland's patients was a spinner named Elizabeth Holroyd. She was 34, had worked in mills since she was 8. In spring of 1840, she was piecing threads on a self-acting mule when her sleeve caught in the driving gear. The machine pulled her forward. She managed to tear free, losing part of her sleeve and sustaining deep bruising to her forearm, but avoiding more serious injury. After that, she couldn't work near the mule without experiencing what Holland described as considerable agitation of the heart. She would approach the machine, attempt to time her movements as before, but her hands would shake. She would hesitate, misjudge the timing, have to withdraw without completing the piecing. Her production declined. After 6 weeks, she was reassigned to carding, work that paid less but kept her away from the moving carriage. The factory records don't mention this. They only note that she was transferred to a different department. But Holland's testimony preserves her experience, and through it, we glimpse something of what these machines meant to the people who worked beside them. Thomas Hulme, the young scavenger, kept working under the mules for 3 years. There's a record of him in the 1841 census. Age 15, occupation listed as factory operative. Parish records show he was present in Stockport throughout the 1840s. But there's also an entry in the accident book at Phillips Mill from October 1843. Thomas Hulme, injury to hand from moving carriage, absent 4 days. 4 days without wages. The injury wasn't described in detail, but the fact that he returned to work suggests it wasn't permanently disabling. He would have learned to wrap the injury, to work more carefully, to adjust his timing, and he would have carried the knowledge that it could happen again. Workers developed bonds around these shared experiences. Spinners who worked adjacent mules would watch each other, ready to call out warnings if someone misjudged a timing. Older workers would position themselves to observe new spinners during their first weeks, offering quiet corrections. Wait for the click. Count 2 more beats. Don't reach across. These weren't formal training sessions. The factory system didn't allocate time for such instruction, but workers created their own safety network through attention and small acts of care. Sometimes the bonds were familial. Fathers taught sons. Mothers trained daughters. At Clarence Mill, a spinner named James Bennett worked alongside his 2 nephews, both in their teens. Factory records show all 3 were employed there from 1838 through the mid-1840s. The arrangement meant Bennett could directly oversee the boys' training, could ensure they learned proper timing and caution. It also meant that when accidents occurred, entire families bore the consequence. In June 1839, a fire started at a Delphi mill in Stockport. The cause was never definitively established, but investigators suspected cotton dust accumulation near a gas lamp ignited when disturbed by machinery vibration. The fire spread rapidly through the cotton waste on the floor and the lint suspended in the air. Workers fled toward the stairwells, but smoke filled the upper floors within minutes. 16 people died, including several children who were working as scavengers and piecers. The Manchester Guardian published their names and ages: Sarah Harper, 9, John Mills, 11, Elizabeth Booth, 13. The list continued. The mill was rebuilt within 18 months. The new building included iron staircases instead of wooden ones and slightly wider exits. But the machinery, including the self-acting mules, was installed with the same configuration as before. No guards over gears, no barriers around moving carriages. The lesson learned was about fire exits, not about the machines themselves. Worker testimony from this period is sparse, but what exists is precise. Samuel Cowlson, a spinner who testified in 1832 before the Sadler Commission, described the experience of working a 16-hour shift at a factory in Manchester. He spoke of exhaustion making judgments slower, of mistakes happening in the final hours when attention wavered, of younger workers who sometimes fell asleep while still standing at their machines. The machines didn't slow for exhaustion. A spinner who misjudged timing at the end of a 16-hour shift faced the same risk as one working fresh at the start of the day. The self-acting mule maintained its rhythm regardless. And yet, workers adapted. They developed a kind of alertness that persisted despite fatigue. They learned to function in the presence of continuous threat, to perform delicate timing in dangerous conditions, to maintain production while staying alive. This adaptation came at a cost that wasn't recorded in factory logs or production reports. It showed in the way workers moved, always aware of space around machinery, always listening for changes in sound. It showed in how they taught their children to work, with emphasis on caution, on never assuming safety, on trusting no machine. John Holland, the factory surgeon, noted in his testimony that experienced mill workers could distinguish between injuries they described as accidents and those they described as the machine's fault. An accident occurred when a worker misjudged or made an error. The machine's fault occurred when equipment malfunctioned, a belt breaking unexpectedly, a gear slipping, a carriage reversing out of rhythm. But the workers understood that from the machine's perspective, there was no distinction. The self-acting mule simply operated according to its design. It moved when power flowed through the drive shaft. It stopped when power was cut. Everything between was a matter of whether humans successfully navigated its movements. By the mid-1840s, self-acting mules had become standard equipment in Lancashire mills. A generation of workers had learned to operate them, had developed the timing and caution necessary to survive their proximity. Children who started as scavengers progressed to piecers, then to spinners, carrying forward the accumulated knowledge of how to work safely amid dangerous machinery. That knowledge was never written down. It lived in gestures, warnings, the practiced movements of hands and bodies. It lived in the way experienced workers positioned themselves, in the sounds they listened for, in the reflexes they developed. It lived in the careful, constant awareness that the machine would not yield. On the morning of March 17, 1844, at Phillips Mill in Stockport, the drive belt on a self-acting mule slipped from its pulley. The belt was 8 inches wide, made of leather, running at high speed along the ceiling. When it slipped, it fell across 2 spinning frames below, striking a piecer named Mary Richards. The impact knocked her to the floor. The belt, still under tension from the drive shaft, whipped back toward the ceiling. Richards sustained a fractured collarbone and severe bruising. She was carried to the factory surgeon's office. Production on that section of the floor stopped for 45 minutes while the belt was repositioned and the broken threads were cleared. The factory's accident book, preserved in the Stockport Heritage Library, contains a single-line entry. M. Richards, injury from belt, March 17, 1844. There's no mention of her recovery time or whether she returned to work. This was a typical documentation of industrial injury in the 1840s. Brief, focused on the production disruption rather than the human cost. The worker's name, the date, a minimal description of the incident. Sometimes not even that much, just a note about machinery being stopped for cleaning. But occasionally, when injuries were severe enough to reach public attention, more detailed accounts appeared. In July 1841, the Preston Chronicle reported on an inquest held for a spinner named William Collier. He had been working a self-acting mule at Springwood Mill. While reaching in to piece a broken thread, his hand was caught between the moving carriage and the iron frame. The carriage crushed his hand and continued its cycle, dragging him along the floor. Other workers managed to cut power to the drive shaft within seconds, but Collier had sustained severe injuries to his hand and arm. He was taken to Preston Infirmary, where his arm was amputated below the elbow. He died 3 days later from infection. The inquest verdict was accidental death. The coroner's report included testimony from the factory foreman, who stated that Collier was an experienced spinner who understood the dangers of the machinery. No fault was assigned to the factory or the machine's design. Collier left a wife and 3 children. The Preston Chronicle noted that a collection was taken up among the mill workers to assist the family, raising £7 and 4 shillings. These accounts reveal the system's structure. When serious accidents occurred, inquests were held. Testimony was taken from foremen and occasionally from other workers. Verdicts almost universally concluded accidental death or misadventure. The implication was that the machinery was not at fault, the worker had made an error, or circumstances had aligned unfortunately. Factory owners rarely faced consequences. The machinery continued operating. New workers were hired to replace those who were injured or killed. But responses did begin to emerge, slowly, from several directions. In 1833, Parliament passed the Factory Act, which prohibited employment of children under 9 years old in textile mills and limited working hours for children under 13 to 9 hours per day. The Act also appointed factory inspectors to enforce these provisions. The inspectors, there were 4 of them initially, responsible for all of England, began documenting conditions in factories. Their reports are remarkably detailed. Leonard Horner, one of the first factory inspectors, described machinery in Lancashire mills with precision. He noted the absence of guards over gears, the exposed drive belts, the proximity of workers to moving parts. His reports to Parliament in 1836 and 1837 included specific recommendations: enclose dangerous machinery, install guards over gears, prohibit children from cleaning moving equipment. Few of these recommendations were implemented immediately. Factory owners argued that guards would reduce efficiency, that worker training was sufficient to prevent accidents, that the cost of retrofitting machinery would be prohibitive. The inspectors had limited authority to compel changes. But the documentation accumulated. report after report describing similar injuries, similar circumstances, similar outcomes. This documentation became the foundation for later reforms. In 1844, Parliament passed another Factory Act that specifically addressed machinery guarding. It required that every mill gearing in a factory shall be securely fenced. The language was carefully chosen. Securely fenced meant physical barriers around moving parts. Mill gearing included drive shafts, gears, and belts. The Act's enforcement was inconsistent. Factory inspectors could issue citations, but penalties were modest, typically £5 to £10 per violation. Many factory owners paid the fines and continued operating without making changes. But gradually, slowly, guards began to appear on machinery. Workers also organized. The Spinners' Union, formed in the 1820s, focused initially on wages and working hours. But by the 1840s, safety concerns appeared in their petitions and communications. Union representatives testified before parliamentary commissions, describing specific dangers and proposing remedies. John Doherty, a union organizer in Manchester, testified in 1832 about machinery injuries. He presented a list of 23 workers who had lost fingers, hands, or arms in machinery accidents at mills throughout Lancashire during a single year. He argued that these injuries were preventable through mechanical guards and better factory design. His testimony didn't immediately change conditions, but it entered the public record. It became part of the accumulating evidence that industrial machinery posed systematic dangers that individual worker caution couldn't fully address. The response to industrial injuries was slow, but it was not absent. Each accident that reached public attention, each inquest that documented the circumstances, each inspector's report that catalogued dangerous machinery, these created pressure for change. By the late 1840s, newer self-acting mules were sometimes designed with guards over the most accessible gears. Not all manufacturers adopted these designs, and retrofitting older machines remained rare. But the principle had been established. Machinery could be made safer through design, not just through worker caution. The workers who had learned to navigate the unguarded machines continued working. Their accumulated knowledge, their practiced timing, their careful awareness, these remained necessary. But slowly, incrementally, the environment around them began to change. The machine that terrified workers in the 1830s was still dangerous in the 1850s, but it was slightly less dangerous. The guards were imperfect. The enforcement was inconsistent. The change was measured in decades, not years. But it was change. And it began, in large part, because the accidents were documented, because surgeons like John Holland testified, because inspectors like Leonard Horner wrote detailed reports, because union organizers like John Doherty presented lists of injured workers to parliamentary commissions. The self-acting mule didn't become safe, but the conversation about industrial safety began, rooted in the documented experiences of workers who had navigated its dangers. The factory at the end of a shift has its own quality of sound. The drive shaft slows first. The main belt loses tension, begins to sag slightly. The individual machines, looms, spinning frames, mules, continue for a few seconds on momentum, then gradually quiet. Spindles slow their rotation. Carriages complete a final cycle and stop. The rumble of iron wheels on wooden floors fades. What remains is smaller sounds, the tick of cooling metal, the creak of floorboards as workers move toward the exits. Low conversations, brief exchanges about tomorrow's work, the shuffle of feet on stairs. Outside, the evening air is clearer. The smell of coal smoke is still present, but dissipated, mixed with weather and the scent of the river. Workers walk in loose groups, heading toward homes in the rows of brick cottages that surround the mill district. Some stop at corner shops. Others continue directly, carrying the day's exhaustion. The factory's windows show lamplight for another hour. Foremen complete production counts. Maintenance workers oil machinery, check belts, prepare equipment for tomorrow's start. Then those lights extinguish as well, and the building settles into its night silence. The self-acting mule changed textile production fundamentally. It increased output by factors of 3 to 5 compared to hand-powered mules. It allowed mills to produce more uniform thread at lower cost. It made cotton cloth affordable to a broader population, contributing to the expansion of textile markets throughout the 19th century. It also established a pattern that would repeat through the Industrial Revolution and beyond. New technology increasing productivity while creating new categories of danger for workers. The dangers of the self-acting mule were specific to its design: moving carriages, exposed gears, the need for human intervention in mechanical processes. But the broader pattern, productivity gains prioritized over worker safety, appeared in coal mines with steam-powered equipment, in iron foundries with mechanized hammers, in railways with increasingly powerful locomotives. Each industry developed its own catalogue of injuries, its own roster of workers who learned machinery through proximity and caution, its own accumulation of accidents that eventually drove slow reforms. The Factory Acts of the 1830s and 1840s were among the first systematic attempts to regulate industrial safety. They were limited in scope and enforcement, but they established a precedent. Workplace safety could be a matter of public policy, not just individual responsibility. This precedent expanded gradually. The Factory Act of 1850 extended regulations to more industries. The 1856 Act strengthened inspection powers. The 1878 Act consolidated and expanded previous legislation, creating a more comprehensive framework for industrial safety. These laws didn't eliminate danger. Even at the end of the 19th century, factory work remained hazardous, but the trajectory was established: incremental improvement driven by documented harm and sustained advocacy. The workers who operated self-acting mules in the 1830s and 1840s rarely saw these later reforms. William Radcliffe, who learned the machine at Phillips Mill in 1834, appeared in census records through 1851, still listed as a cotton spinner. There's no record of his death date or circumstances. Like most industrial workers, his life left only fragmentary traces in official documents. Thomas Hulme, the young scavenger, appeared in the 1851 census as well, age 25, occupation listed as spinner. He had progressed from cleaning under machines to operating them. This progression, from the most dangerous entry-level work to slightly less precarious skilled work, was the closest thing to advancement available to most factory workers. Elizabeth Holroyd, who developed a fear of the mule after her sleeve caught in the gears, disappeared from records after 1841. She may have continued working in the carding room. She may have left factory work entirely. She may have died. Mortality rates for working-class women in industrial towns were high, though specific causes often went unrecorded. These individual stories fade into the larger pattern of industrial life. Hundreds of thousands of workers learned to operate self-acting mules over the course of the 19th century. They developed the timing, the caution, the practiced awareness necessary to survive proximity to powerful machinery. Some were injured. Some were killed. Most simply worked, day after day, navigating the dangers as part of the job's requirements. Their collective experience shaped labor movements, influenced legislation, and gradually redefined society's understanding of workplace safety. The idea that machinery should be designed with worker protection in mind, an idea that seems obvious now, emerged from decades of accidents, documentation, and advocacy. The self-acting mule itself evolved. Later designs incorporated guards, improved lighting, better spacing between machines. By the 1880s, some mills were installing electric motors for individual machines, replacing the long drive shaft systems that had created additional hazards. By the early 20th century, textile production was shifting toward ring spinning, a technology that was faster and less dangerous than mule spinning. But the mule's legacy persisted in industrial culture. The understanding that machines could threaten workers, that productivity and safety could conflict, that individual caution, while necessary, wasn't sufficient to prevent systematic harm. These insights, learned through experience at machines like the self-acting mule, influenced how later generations approached industrial design and regulation. There's a memorial in Stockport, installed in 1997, dedicated to workers who died in industrial accidents during the 19th century. It's a simple granite stone in the churchyard at St. Mary's, inscribed with the phrase, "In memory of those who built our prosperity." No names are listed. There were too many, and records were incomplete. The memorial stands a quarter-mile from where Phillips Mill once operated. The mill was demolished in 1964. The site is now a car park and a small office building. Nothing marks where the factory stood, where the self-acting mules operated, where workers learned timing and caution through proximity to danger. But the memory persists in documents, in factory inspectors' reports, in surgeons' testimonies, in census records and accident books, in the factory acts themselves, which remain the foundation of modern occupational safety law. The machine that terrified workers in the 1830s was ultimately just one technology in a long series of technologies that reshaped work. But it was significant because it appeared at a moment when industrial society was learning, slowly, incompletely, to document and respond to the human costs of mechanization. The workers who operated that machine didn't see themselves as part of a historical process. They simply went to the factory each morning, performed their work, navigated the dangers as best they could, and went home. Some days, everyone survived. Some days, someone didn't. The next day, the machines started again. The low sound of the drive shaft engaging, the rumble of iron wheels on wooden floors, the click of gears meshing, the hum of spindles beginning to rotate. And workers, taking their positions, listening for changes in sound, watching the machinery, timing their movements. Aware that the machine would not yield. Learning to work in its present.